Have you noticed that some kids start defying gender norms from a very young age? These children are noticeably different from their same-sex peers, even when they're really small. Their gender nonconformity comes naturally and shows up early. But why do some kids like this develop gender dysphoria, while others don't? Welcome to The Metaphor of Gender. I'm Sasha, a therapist, and this channel is for curious people who prefer deep thinking over dogma. We explore identity, meaning, and how to live life well. This is the first video in a new series, Hidden Roots, where we're exploring 7 different factors that can contribute to and shape gender dysphoria. These factors can overlap and evolve over time, but each of these hidden roots deserves its own space for reflection. So I'm giving each one a dedicated video. Some people, again, are innately gender nonconforming. So I'm not talking about a curated performance here. I'm talking about what comes naturally, organically, and spontaneously. From very early childhood, children like this simply behave much more like their opposite-sex peers, and they break gender norms early and often in their mannerisms, clothing choices, and play preferences. Sometimes, children like this feel perfectly fine about being different, until the comments begin. For example, if a little boy who is traditionally very feminine gets to preschool or kindergarten, other kids might start saying things like, "Are you really a boy because you act like a girl?" Or, "Boys aren't supposed to play with dolls, that's weird." Sometimes parents may also try to push their child to, quote, act more like a normal boy or girl. Maybe the family's religion or community strongly discourages stepping outside of traditional gender norms. And sometimes the child is already categorizing themselves as the opposite sex, because, understandably, they do feel more connected to their opposite sex peers. Now, this dynamic can get even more complicated after puberty, when behaviors and preferences tend to become even more sex differentiated, and the divide between guys and girls grows wider. Naturally non-conforming teens stand out even more as the social pressure to fit in increases. And especially when teenagers are discovering their sexuality. If they're attracted to people of the same sex, this can be hard to accept. For one, because sexuality is intensely personal and feels weird for most of us in the teenage years. And it can also be hard to accept their budding sexuality because of outside pressures that discourage being gay. And this relationship between sexual orientation and childhood gender nonconformity is backed up by many, many decades of evidence. We have lots of research showing a correlation between childhood gender nonconformity, including experiences of gender dysphoria, and later coming out as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So, a combination of internal conflict and societal pressure can create a divide between what feels natural and authentic and how someone feels they are supposed to be. Now, this can lead to discomfort and ambivalence about biological sex. It's important to note here, there are natural variations in people's personalities and preferences when it comes to how masculine or feminine they are. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a child or teen who falls outside of the average here. This is just the diversity of how people show up in the world. It's not pathological and it doesn't need to be fixed. Now, we have to pause for a second here, because when we start to talk about gender nonconformity, we are stepping into the world of norms and stereotypes. Being nonconforming by definition means you're talking about a norm. And norms tend to evolve from observed averages. So for example, boys are, on average, more interested in rough and tumble play than girls. But of course, you know how averages work. There are lots of boys who don't like to play that way. They fall outside of the norm for their sex. And here's where the social enforcement comes in. Even if it's not their preference, boys might be encouraged to play sports or to act tough. Parents might sign them up for Little League when they'd rather be playing with dolls or playing dress up with their sister, and so on. I'm sure you can think of other examples. So norms are both objective observations about patterns and trends, and they're also often socially encouraged and reinforced. And I strongly suspect that if gender nonconforming kids grew up in more flexible, accepting environments, where their preferences were nurtured rather than corrected, they might not experience as much distress. They might not develop gender dysphoria at all. But then you might ask, why is it that some people were very gender nonconforming as kids, they experienced those same social pressures, but didn't develop gender dysphoria? There's no single definitive answer here, but from my clinical experience, I believe it has a lot to do with outer and inner forces. If someone grows up in a really strict religious community, for example, where loved ones say that it's wrong to have traits of the other sex, they may develop an internal conflict and a lot of shame, especially if they're also attracted to the same sex. On the other hand, a kid might have a very supportive family and only hear rigid gender messages from the outside world, maybe a stranger's comment or just something they read about online. In that case, they might just brush it off and move on. But still, that's not the whole picture. Some people grow up in very rigid environments and still end up accepting their gender nonconformity and sexual orientation. How? I think this points to individual personality traits, those inner forces. Now, before we get into it, let me explain what I mean by personality. Each of us has a long-standing, stable personality that shapes how we think, feel, behave, relate to others, and experience ourselves. I really like this definition from psychotherapist Jonathan Shedler. Personality is a person's characteristic pattern of thought, feeling, behavior, motivation, defense, interpersonal functioning, and ways of experiencing self and others. So let's take an example here. Jaden's personality makes her more prone to negative emotions and self-criticism. She's really sensitive to rejection. She likes girls and has several quote-unquote boy interests, and overhears a homophobic joke. She internalizes it deeply. Jaden wonders, what does this mean about me? Would that person still accept me if they knew who I am? Now let's say William has a more emotionally steady personality. He also has same-sex attractions and is gender nonconforming. But William doesn't tend to ruminate. He hears the same joke as Jaden, rolls his eyes, and barely thinks about it again. Our personalities will influence how confident and self-assured we feel. They influence whether we get very anxious or doubt ourselves, and when we face uncertainty, are we just nervous, or do we also have a sense of resilience? So someone who is highly prone to social anxiety might really struggle if people stare too long or make comments about their appearance. And those small moments can build up and become really overwhelming. So, today we looked at how natural and spontaneous gender nonconformity, personality traits, and social pressures can combine and contribute to one form of gender dysphoria. But there are other factors too, ones that relate to a person's physical body, their intellectual life, their community, and many other things. In the next video, we'll explore physical and anatomical dysphoria, so please be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. If anything in this video resonated with you or gave you something to think about, please consider liking or sharing it. It really helps others to find content like this. Okay, that's it for today. Keeping one foot in reality and one in possibility. I'll see you next time. This information is meant for educational purposes only, and not as a substitute for mental health services.